Right, morning everyone. This is our penultimate training webinar for this year's training series. And today we're going to be looking at the introduction to rock outcrops, cliffs and screes, which is one of our NPMS broad scale habitats. As usual, our brilliant Ben Averis is going to be the one delivering the webinar. I'm just going to be the one sharing my screen and clicking next slide for him just to save on bandwidth. Also, Ben will have, he will talk, but he won't have his camera on. Again, this is to do with bandwidth. If you have any questions for Ben or myself, then do use the question and answer function, and we will have a little session at the end answering some of those. Some of them I may be able to answer during as well, and we can sort of discuss the answers. If you've got any questions directly about Zoom or anything else that you want to use the chat function for, that's absolutely fine. If you want to say where you're watching from or that sort of thing. Just remember though, on the section where it says to, remember to select all panelists and attendees. Otherwise only Ben and myself will be able to see it and not everyone else. I hope you enjoy today. If at any point you do lose connection or you have to go and do something else, it is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel as well, probably next week. Yeah, hopefully everyone will enjoy it. Ben, are you ready to unmute yourself?
Yep, there we are. Okay, can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you. I will turn off my camera and my microphone and leave it up to you, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you. So hello everybody. See, we've got 21 participants there. Very good. Somebody says good morning from Liverpool, and I'm saying good morning from Scotland, and Sarah's saying good morning from somewhere in the south of England. We're all over the place. That's good. So yeah, rock habitats. Well, just a nice picture of ferns and moss on there. And if we go on to the next slide, and actually the next one after that as well, is the beginning of the stuff that I've put together, which is a sort of illustrated tour around different examples of different species of this rock habitat as it occurs in different parts of Britain in different forms. As with some of these light-hearted beginning, as with some of these presentations, I've written a silly poem. I didn't do one for, actually I did write one for the coastal habitats last time, but the thing was so long I didn't say it. Rocky habitats one. Okay, rocks and stones and cliffs and scree, won't be many plants to see, just lots of grey, the colour thin, cold and steely, looking grim, scrappy bits of boring mosses. That's enough, cut your losses, head back home where you can bake a lovely lemon drizzle cake. Lots of sugar, tasting sweet. There's cooking now, can't wait to eat. Forgot to set the timing clock. Overdone, hard as rock. Okay, so there is some of that boring, cold, steely, grey rock habitat in front of you in that drawing I've done as part of Ben Nevis. It's not really that boring. I wasn't being serious about that, but if we go on to the next slide, then we can start actually talking about the actual content of this habitat and what it all means. So what it is all kind of rock habitat, basically, that's not coastal. Rock and scree that's not coastal, otherwise the coastal stuff comes into that maritime cliff and slope fine scale habitat of the NPMS coastal broad habitat. But there's still a lot of variation here, and the NPMS divides it into two fine scale habitats. Basically, one is montane and the other one isn't. The one that's not is called inland rocks and scree, and the one that's not that is montane is called montane. They're both inland, of course. And the NPMS, they have a figure of a sort of guidance figure of 600 meters as the threshold. Although I've made some notes there that actually when you go further north, especially far northwest, you can get montane habitats coming down quite a lot lower, and you can tell that they're montane by the nature of them, the kind of species. You get montane species occurring lower down because it's a harsher climate, and montane versus non-montane is best they're best separated really on the basis of climate, a sort of very harsh climate is what defines the montane environment. I'll be showing some pictures later on of the kind of montane species that you can look out for that will really indicate that you're in the montane version of the rock and scree habitat. The montane one is much smaller in extent. It's confined to mostly higher ground, but as I say, it gets lower in the far northwest. The great bulk of it, though, this this rock habitat is the first fine-scale habitat, inland rocks and scree. It also includes some kind of artificial-ish habitats like quarries, you know, where it's not totally artificial substrate, but it's not a natural kind of formation. But it doesn't include built structures, like, as I said, dams and stone walls and buildings. Although you can get some interesting plants growing on some of those, especially the older ones. So what we can do is start off looking at the non-montane one. And if we go to the next slide, this is the first of a few. There's 5 pages where I've shown some ferns, because as the NPMS guidance does mention that ferns are pretty significant in these rock habitats, and indeed, of course, they are. So we'll run through some pictures of ferns and have a look at their identification features. 3 on this page. These are all small ferns that can grow on steep rocks in little crevices and cracks and things. Wall rue on the left is it's very small, although it's got quite a sort of firm texture, and it's a greyish green colour, and the fronds are divided up in the same sort of shape as so many of the bigger ferns, so roughly a sort of triangular frond. But being so small, it's not surprising that there are not very many divisions in there. So it's a fairly simple looking pinnately divided fern, easy thing to recognise. And it's classed as an NPMS positive indicator in this non-montane habitat. The two, the middle one and right one, are both very distinct in that they've got long, thin fronds with lots of what look like leaflets, or pinnae really, along the sides, and they form little clumps on steep rock faces and on walls. In the case of the middle one, the maidenhair spleenwort. The maidenhair spleenwort is much the commonest, very common plant on all kinds of rocks and yeah, old walls, old buildings, and is an NPMS positive indicator in both of the two fine-scale habitats here. It's got a very dark stem up the middle, in contrast to the green spleenwort on the right, which is all green and is actually much less common. It's mainly on base-rich rocks like limestone, on basalt and a few others, schists, and is easy to tell because it's all green. It's mainly in upland areas as well, especially in shady places. Always a good find, that one. The next slide has again some not massive ferns. The one on the left is actually going on from the previous slide where we had those spleenworts. The rusty back fern is in the same general shape and roughly the same similar sort of size as those spleenworts, kind of long and thin with fairly simple looking pinnae up the sides, but it's got a much thicker texture and it's got a russety colour underneath. So it really does look very different. And it's mainly in the southwest, especially on rocks and walls that are not so acid. It does go here and there further north and east, but it's possibly introduced there in those places, not really sure. The polypody on the right is getting a bit bigger, but the fronds are still quite simple. They're not divided in the more multiple ways that they are in some of the bigger ferns like male fern and butler ferns and so on. And it grows on rocks, walls, and on trees. There are actually 3 different kinds of polypody. They can be a bit fiddly to separate, and for NPMS purposes, they're just all lumped together. It's mainly Polypodium vulgare is the main one, the commonest one by far. And excuse me. The only thing that polypody really looks like that's not polypody is Blechnum, the hard fern, But that's a more tufted thing, and it's got a shiny, glossy, more leathery sort of texture. And it grows on more consistently on acid soil. The polypody can look a bit tufty, a bit kind of clumped, although it actually grows along from a kind of creeping rhizome that's going up under the sort of on the bark surface, or just along the wall, and little fronds coming here and there. But they can come quite in quite a sort of clump in some places, to look as if making it look as if it's almost as tufted as the hard fern. But polypody is not glossy, and it's and it's more, you know, it's not so definitely tufted as the hard fern is. So easy to tell the two apart. Okay, the next picture has got some ferns that are still quite small as ferns go, but these are the more usual typical kind of fern shape. They're kind of long, triangular, divided up into lots of different segments. The black spleenwort on the left is pretty easy one to tell because it's slightly glossy, quite firm texture, and the main stem gets very, very dark in its lower part. What we can see there is the green bit, but if you were able to follow that through, it would get very dark, almost blackish. And it grows on rock faces and on walls as well, where the rock is quite basic. So easy to tell with that dark base to the stem, slight shine to it. The brittle bladder fern, on the other hand, is a much more papery kind of texture, very, very finely divided, and it forms little clumps in usually shaded, sheltered places, little sort of recesses on steep rock faces, especially in the uplands, where the rock is kind of basic. Always quite a nice find, that. It's like a bit like a kind of miniature male fern or miniature buckler fern, but yeah, consistently small and quite thin, slightly papery texture to it. Next picture has got a couple of species that are related to each other very closely, but they look quite different. The one on the left, the oak fern, is the commoner of the two, and it's the more distinctive as well, because its stems, you know, and the branches within the whole frond are really, really thin and wiry, so much so that they can be sort of half hidden. When you look at that picture there, what you really see most is the green, that kind of bright green frond material, almost as if it's kind of floating above the ground there. Beautiful fern, and the ends of the pinnae and the subpinnae, the sort of fine little divisions there, are really quite blunt, and they've got little teeth around their edges. The whole thing starts off quite rolled up, a bit like the way bracken does, and in fact it resembles in some sense a kind of very miniature bracken in that it's not tufted. You have an underground creeping rhizome spreading around, and then single fronds arising from it, many of them, so they form patches in the way that bracken does, compared with things like buckler ferns, which are quite different. They're just individual big shuttlecock tufts, quite different again. So yeah, quite unmistakable really, the oak fern. Wiry thin stems, and there's beautiful delicate pale yellowy green blunt tipped leaf frond divisions. Beautiful thing. The lime sorry about this funny thing in my throat. Let's drink some coffee, that might help it. The limestone fern actually it's much less common. They're always a really good find in limestone areas, among limestone rocks, but it looks more kind of ordinary, like an ordinary littleish version of some kind of male fern or buckler fern, you know, divided up a bit more finely than the oak fern, but it doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't have such a really delicate appearance. It's just like a sort of very, very miniature buckler fern kind of plant. It's a sort of slightly softish green color, not as bright green as some of the bigger ferns, and the stems are actually very thin. but they don't look quite as, relatively as sort of really, really thin and wiry as they do in the oak fern. Very different looking. Consistently, it's among rocks in limestone areas, quite local, mainly in the southern half of Britain, from South Cumbria and the Pennines southwards. The next picture has got a couple of other ferns that are mainly in more base-rich, not always just limestone, but generally the variety of different kinds of base-rich rocks and soils. Heart's tongue, you'll never mistake that for anything else. Very, very tough, textured, leathery fern. Frond is not divided up at all, and it's rather heart-shaped at its base. See those two lobes, one on each side, pointing backwards, and it's got a thick, rather scaly lower stem there, and it comes in tufts, completely unmistakable. Hard shield fern, it's kind of built more like lots of other biggish tufted, medium-sized to big tufted ferns like male ferns and so on, with lots of divisions, but it's a little bit glossy, and the final segments, final divisions there end in rather bristle-like points, so it's got this sort of rather sharp look to it. The thing that it resembles most in that sense then is the soft shield fern, Polystichum setiferum, but that's a rather bigger plant, and the fronds are much more of a matte finish. They don't have this leathery and slightly shiny upper surface that you find in the hard shield fern. There are other differences in sort of slight details of the shapes of the bases of the pinnules, but generally you can tell it by that sort of dark and slightly rather shiny texture. So next slide, having gone through those 5 pages of pictures of ferns, as in some of these other ones, we've had, oh, there's a thing come up, quiz 1 in progress. These these NPMS presentations, we've had some questions in quite a few of them, because I've been given to understand that that's what you folks like to have thrown at you. So yeah, how do you tell the maidenhair spleamer from the green? And there's a multiple choice thing come here. And if somebody thinks they've seen patches of miniature bracken, what do you think they've been looking at? Interesting to see the answers here. We give you just a wee bit more time to
just to say that it's completely anonymous, so nobody knows what you've done, so you can totally have a stab in the dark. It's absolutely fine, and I'll do it a couple of seconds and I'll share the results. Okay,
so you can make as much of a fool of yourself as you like, and nobody will know it was you. Not that you're making fools of yourself if you get it wrong. It's perfectly normal, perfectly okay. So there we are. Yep, the dark stem is the thing for the maidenhair spleen worts. It stands out so much from the paler green of the pinnae. And the thing that looks like the miniature bracken among all the species we've seen is the oak fern, which of course it doesn't actually look like bracken. When you see bracken, that's quite different. So that's that's good. And I'll just click that thing off there, and that folds. I'd put a page with the answers there. And there's somebody rather unkindly calling that guy a fool because he thought he was looking at miniature bracken, but perfectly, we can't be getting everything right from the beginning. That's how we learn things. I can think back to my history and make some mistakes that I've made. Okay, so if we go on to the next slide, moving away from the ferns, we can look at some other things, some herbs, and there'll be some grasses as well in a bit. So these are species that grow quite commonly in at least some of the inland rock and scree Finescale habitats, as well as in other habitats as well. Most of these things are not confined, well, I think almost none of them are really confined to rock habitats. So the first three here, well, actually the first two are mainly in woodland. They like shady places, and so where they occur in rock habitats, they tend to be in little recesses, places like the cracks in the limestone pavements. I'll have a photo of some limestone pavements a bit later on. The dog's mercury is a pretty distinctive thing. It forms big patches of upright shoots with sort of mid-green to yellowy green leaves in opposite pairs. Leaves themselves are really quite ordinary looking. They look a bit like willow leaves of some kind, some of the broader kinds of willows, with teeth along their edges. Flowers, pale green things with lots of catkin-like spikes. They come up quite early, those flowers. So it's quite a distinctive thing found, especially on relatively base-rich soils in woods like ashwoods and elmwoods and places like that. Herb Roberts is quite a different thing, with very cut up leaves in a kind of palmate fashion that is all coming out from one single point in radiating lobes or leaflets. There's leaflets here all cut up very deeply. They have quite a nice sort of smell to them as well, and the stems are rather reddish and hairy, and those little pink flowers are quite unmistakable as well. Mainly in woodland on especially basic soils, but neutral-ish soils as well. And the third one, hairy violet. I haven't got a picture of the flower. I still don't think, even since I wrote that. I wrote this document, by the way, last year, 2020. Even since then, I still haven't seen a flower of hairy violet. But I've seen the leaves of it loads of times. Oh, Sarah says she's posted some on the social media pages. That's good. Don't get me wrong, I don't expect that the flowers of hairy violet are sort of great big yellow things or something crazy. I know they'll be like violet flowers, purpley things. But the leaves are a thing that's distinctive and have enabled people like me to identify without the flowers many, many times. Hairy, quite hairy leaf, the little hairs up to about 1 millimeter or so long over the leaf surface and the leaf stalks as well. And the leaves can typically be rather longer, quite distinctly longer than wide, which contrasts with, say, the sweet violets, which can be a bit hairy, with rather shorter hairs, really, but tends to be relatively broader. So it's a species of various kinds of grasslands, coastal places, but it can grow among rocks as well. Hence, it's listed in the, it's included among these species. And well, these three on this page are all NPMS positive indicators in this habitat. And before we can go on to the next page, and while we're doing that, I should say, if you don't know already, positive indicators are species that generally are pretty good to see in the habitat because they suggest that things are going pretty well, that it's in reasonable condition, and so on, not too sort of damaged. Okay, these three species grow very commonly in a whole range of other habitats, as was the case with the ones on the previous page, but they can include in very rocky places, hence their inclusion here. Common dog violet, very much about the commonest violet in Britain as a whole, and certainly up here in Scotland, because some of the other species are rather more southern. Leaves are mid to slightly darkish green, usually a bit longer than wide, not much so. And the little projecting spur at the back of the flower, which you can't actually see in that photo because it's hidden, but it's quite pale. The leaves can have some little very, very short hairs on them, but they're not really that hairy, nothing like the hairy violets. It flowers mainly in spring, but I haven't to find it flowering in August. And that's what prompted me to take that photo. Tormentil is really, really common in all kinds of mainly acid places like grasslands and heaths, and in woodland on fairly acid soils as well. Not surprising because it's so common, not surprising that it gets them among rocks in many places too, especially in the uplands. Easy to tell when it's in flower with those 4-petaled yellow flowers. They're quite small flowers, smaller than buttercup flowers. Leaves, even without the flowers, you can pick it out quite easily by the leaves because each leaf has 3 leaflets. They're kind of narrow oval shape with relatively big teeth in their outer half. So they look quite sort of jaggy, and some of them can look as if they got 5 leaflets, because at the very base of the leaf you can get a couple of stipules that look like miniature leaflets. Some of the leaves are stalked, some of the leaves up, especially further up the stems, are unstalked. And when you see those little stipules at the very base, just where the leaf comes off the stem, they may look like leaflets, but coming right from the stem itself, from the very base of the leaf, they are actually stipules. So the leaf really has 3 leaflets. There are other kinds of potentillas that have leaves vaguely, rather similar, but with more leaflets. Okay, heath bedstraw very commonly accompanies the tormentil in acid places like grasslands and heaths and acid woods and so on, especially where it's grazed. But it's so common, again, it can get in rocky places too. It's a low creeping bedstraw with a very smooth texture, because it doesn't have any of these kind of little tiny hairs that point backwards and give it a rather rough feel, as is the case with so many bedstraws. In the case of the heath bedstraw, the stem doesn't have any hairs, and the leaves do have little tiny hairs along their edges. They point forwards, and they're quite soft texture. So if you feel the plant up and down, it just feels really smooth. It's an incredibly common plant. So if you're among acid rocks and you find some little bedstraw creeping about there, it's probably going to be that species. On the next page, we got some rather bigger plants. Marjoram is mainly where the rocks and soils are a bit more basic, and it grows upright and has these opposite pairs of oval leaves that are a little bit hairy. The stem's quite hairy. Easiest to tell in flower, of course, when you've got those distinctive dense clumps of pale pink flowers. It's commonest in the south, though it does grow scattered further north. We came across some, my wife and I came across some the other day, actually, up near Tom and Tool in the East Highlands. Yeah, easy thing to tell, especially when it's in flower. Otherwise, it can look a little bit like a kind of mint, slightly, with those leaves a bit hairy and in opposite pairs, and it's about the same kind of size, but it doesn't have that minty smell to it. The wall lettuce, the photograph here doesn't show the flowers, which are yellow, and they're really quite small, and they come in very open branched clusters. The kind of cluster of a flower that's difficult to photograph and get the flowers in focus, because there's a lot more space than there is actually material, because it's all so open and those branches are so thin and the flowers are so small. However, the leaves are what is particularly distinctive, so it's a good job I got a photo of those. Really deeply divided in such a way that it looks almost as if they can't decide whether to go right down, divide themselves so deep as to be in leaflets as opposed to lobes. They're very deeply cut, almost to this sort of central stalk there, but still kind of joined together. So they are kind of lobes, really, and each of those lobes is cut up as well. And the big one at the end is rather triangular and yeah, with those sort of slightly jaggy edges, and it's not really hairy, so it's kind of smooth texture, quite unmistakable. It's mainly in shady places, among rocks, or at the bases of rock outcrops, bases of cliffs, and along walls, and on walls as well. Sometimes you can find it, mainly in lowland areas. The horseshoe vetch on the right is one of these things in the pea family that's got yellow flowers, looking like the yellow flowers of quite a few other things, like bird's foot trefoil, which is much more common and much more widespread. The horseshoe vetch being really a very southern plant, southern lowlands mainly. And if you can tell it from things like the bird's foot trefoil, which is the main other the commonest yellow pea flower kinds of plants. Well, actually, that, and there's also the Averis pratensis, the meadow vetchling, which also has yellow flowers and is in the pea family. But actually the meadow vetchling flowers are in a little bit more of a kind of spike, and its leaflets, which come on the left and right sides of the main leaf stalk, as is the case with the horseshoe vetch here. The leaflets are much bigger and much far fewer in number. Horseshoe vetch here has little typical vetch-like leaves with lots of little leaflets coming off the sides of the of a sort of central stalk. You can get several pairs, 4 or 5 or so pairs of little leaflets with one at the end. You know how some vetches have just tendrils, those twirly tendrils at the very end. Well, this one actually has another leaflet right at the end of it. The bird's foot trefoil, in contrast, has just 3 leaflets, like a clover, although it does also have a couple of stipules at the very base of the leaf stalk. So it kind of looks like 5, but there's but those stipules, like in the tormentil, they're attached to the main stem of the plant. They're not, you know, they're separate things structurally, really, from the actual leaflets themselves, although they look just like leaflets. So the bird's foot trefoil has 3 leaflets, and the horseshoe vetch has a lot more, all in pairs arranged along that that leaf stalk. When it's in fruit, it has these long sort of pods of a kind of wavy, wiggly sort of shape to them. Look to them. I haven't got a photograph of it like that. Okay, the next slide has got some more plants we find in this habitat. Rue-leaved saxifrage is a very small saxifrage, has typical white saxifragey flowers. But the whole thing's small, quite reddish tinged, and it grows in dry places that it likes a little bit of sun, dry and sunny, mainly in the lowlands, especially in the southern half of Britain. The leaves are sort of cut up quite deeply, as they are in some of the other saxifrages too. Sort of small, red tinge at least, and very hairy. And it's an annual as well. The salad burnet is a bigger thing, with leaves, with lots of pairs of leaflets up the leaf stalk, and the leaflets have got quite jaggy teeth along their edges. They're very neat looking leaves, actually, quite fine, splendid looking plants, which is with the leaves just as well, because the flowers ain't so much to look at, really. They're just those kind of green blobby things, a bit like, you know how plantain flowers are a bit, I suppose, dull to look at. There's nothing wrong with them being dull coloured. But these are a bit like that. It's like the ribwort plantain, but as if someone's cut the ends off, so they're just really, really short, and they're kind of greeny, slightly pinky green colour. Easiest to tell by those leaves. Nothing much else with those leaves like that. Grape burnets, which is bigger plants, has the leaflets on a bit more of a stalk and with a slightly heart-shaped base to the leaflet as well, and it grows in damper places. The salad burnet is mainly on drier, base-rich soils, especially in the southern lowlands, in the southern half of Britain. By the time you get into Scotland, it's a really pretty rare plant. Those two strawberry things on the right, well, I've only illustrated one, that's the barren strawberry, but we also have to bear in mind the wild strawberry, Fragaria vesca, which is the one that has the fruits. The barren strawberry doesn't. But if it doesn't, if you find stuff like that with these 3 leaflets with little teeth along the edge, and so it's looking like one of these things and there aren't any fruits, it could be either species, and the best way to tell them apart is to look on the underside of the leaf, and you'll find that in the barren strawberry there are lots of hairs that stick outwards, whereas in the wild strawberry it does have hairs as well, but they're so closely pressed to the underside of the leaflets that at first glance actually you might think it's not hairy. It looks quite smooth. There are other differences. The wild strawberry's leaves do get a bit bigger, and they tend to have more veins, more obvious veins running in straighter and parallel to each other on the upper surface. And the wild strawberry commonly has these runners as well that go over the ground, and they can be reddish tinged. So it's got a slightly different overall growth form, but yeah, small plants without any fruits. You can find yourself needing to check those leaves. Leaves are a bit duller colour on the whole in the barren strawberry as well. They both got white flowers like that. Okay, next page, we've got some grasses. Grasses can be very common, tucked away in crevices or on ledges among the rocks. These species on this page are all common ones that we find, especially in grasslands and in grassy woods, except the one on the right is not really found in woods, and the one in the middle, the sheep's fescue, neither, not much in the woods. But they're very common in quite a range of habitats, and not surprisingly, they come in mixed with rocks as well. Common bent is one of our commonest grasses that has a very branched, very delicately, intricately branched flower head. It's not that big. It's a sort of medium height grass with leaves really very ordinary, a few millimeters wide, and then they taper gradually to a very fine tip. And there are a number of different bent grasses that all look much like that. And the common bent you can tell from the other ones because it's ligule, which is a little kind of flap at the base of the leaf blade. It's very, very short. The other species of Agrostis have a longer one. It's an incredibly common plant in all sorts of places, from the tops of the mountains right down to sea level. Sweet vernal grass is very wide-ranging as well, and it's easy to tell in flower with that head. It's not a branched flower head. It's just got a cluster of all these relatively long spikelets, individual spikelets, quite long and shiny green when they first come out, and then they die off to a pale kind of golden color, and they remain there for quite a long time into the autumn. So it's pretty easy to pick out. You can also tell it in leaf because the leaf blades, the photograph of the base of the leaf blade there, you get these longish hairs at the base of the leaf blade. As well as the ligule. The ligule is hidden in that photograph because it's the other side of the leaf stalk, the other side of the flowering stem, sorry. And actually the leaves taste of almonds, especially in the spring when they come out. It comes out quite early in sweet vernal grass. Sheep's fescue and red fescue, they've got very thin, wiry leaves in contrast to the first two species there. Leaves no more than 1 millimeter or so across. The sheep's fescue is like a smaller version of red fescue, so the leaves are shorter. I've given some dimensions there, approximate dimensions, and the whole plant is shorter. The flowering stem's shorter, the flowering head is smaller, and particularly the flowering head, even though it's branched, these are branched flowering heads. The branches are they don't tend to open out very much in the sheep's fescue. They do in the red fescue, like that photograph on the of it there. But in the sheep's fescue, they're always held quite close, as if it doesn't want us to know that it's branched. And they both got incredibly short ligules. And the red fescue has another unusual feature that whilst the leaves around the base of the plants that's the bulk of the leaves, are very, very thin and wiry, the ones that grow up the flowering stems are different. It's like a different design of leaf. They're a few millimeters wide. So quite different style. There are not very many grasses that actually have two different types of leaf. Basal leaves and stem leaves are quite different, and so it's quite distinguished in that respect. It's very, very, very common. Most people walk past along road verges and places like that and past red fescue completely oblivious to that distinctiveness that it has. Early hairgrass on the right is like a miniature version of sheep's fescue. It's a very small little thing. It's an annual, so it's a very little thing, and the leaves are very thin and wiry and pretty short. And the thing comes up in the spring, so it can dye back to that kind of color, goldeny color, by the sort of summer or late summer, and depending on the weather of the particular weather conditions of the time that year. But you can always tell it from sheep's fescue, though, by the fact that the flower head, when you look at the individual little spikelets in it, each one has little projecting hair-like thing, which is called an awn. And you don't get those distinctive longer awns in the sheep's fescue. You can get them in red fescue, but that's so much of a bigger plant. You're not going to mistake red fescue for early hairgrass. So it's not surprising that early hairgrass can be among rocks, because it grows particularly well where the soils are really thin and dry. Certain kinds of grasslands in the National Vegetation Classification, there's I think a kind called U1 and also CG7, and these are grasslands on rocks on very thin, dry soils, often among rocks. So early hairgrass is very commonly associated with rock. Okay, the next slide has some more grasses. Coleria is mainly among more basic soil, so among basic rocks. It can grow quite happily. Has a low tuft of leaves, a few millimeters wide. They're actually quite distinctive. They're quite firm textured, rather hairy, and the upper surface of the leaf has a whole series of parallel ridges and grooves. You can just about see it in that photo, looking down at the tuft of leaves. And in that way, it looks a bit like a miniature version of tufted hairgrass, Deschampsia cespitosa, but much, much smaller, and it doesn't have that real serious roughness that the tufted hairgrass does when you feel the leaf backwards, because that's got lots of forward pointing prickly hairs on it. But this is a far, far smaller plant, and the flowering head is unbranched and has lots of little spikelets that can stick out when it's fully open, as in that photo there, the right-hand shoot. But probably more often than not, you kind of see it looking really quite closed, a bit like a sort of rather bulky flowering head of sheep's fescue, not that different superficially to that. Obviously, when you look at the leaves, then you would never mistake it for sheep's fescue, because that sheep's fescue has got really thin, wiry leaves. So, yeah, it's always quite a nice find, crested hairgrass. Meadow oat grass, there is a much bigger thing. It's got tufts of leaves that are very kind of glaucous color, kind of bluey grey tinge on their upper surface. And when they taper to a pointed tip, that all happens right at the very end of the leaf. They're mainly parallel sided, and then suddenly at the end, in a very short distance, it goes to a point, so it looks kind of blunt a bit. And on the underside of the leaf of the meadow oat grass, the color is rather more of darker looking ordinary green with a bit of a shine to it. It's in fact, it's the opposite way around to how it is with lots of leaves of all sorts of plants, where if there was going to be one surface darker and a bit more shiny, and another surface not at all shiny and a bit paler and more greyish tinged, the latter would probably be the undersurface, like, for example, some of the kinds of willows. It's unusual to find something that goes the other way around, darker and shinier underneath. But one that does have that is, another one that has that is the bottle sedge, Carex rostrata. I don't think you're going to mistake bottle sedge for meadow oat grass. The habitats are totally different. This meadow oat grass likes it dry on where the soil's kind of basic, more or less, and very common among rocks where the rock is of that type. Bottle sedge grows in very wet places, much wet places, and has leaves that taper more gradually to a point. They're a completely different plant. Meadow oat grass, they've changed its name, and what I put there is not the most recent name. It's actually, we now have to call it Helictocloa pratensis. Although if you write Helictotrichon, people will still know what we mean. It's also gone in the past by the name Avenula as well, Avenula pratensis. These things, people change their names, don't they? But the plant is pretty distinctive. Oh, the flowering head, by the way, is distinct as well. It's got those long spikelets that are rather shiny, with a bit of a silvery or purplish silvery sheen to them, and lots of these long projecting hair-like awns at their tips. Distinctive big grass with rather stiff texture. The leaves are rather stiff, and the stems likewise. Oak-quaking grass, the final one, the leaves are really quite ordinary looking. They're a few millimeters wide and nothing very distinctive about them at all. but the flowering stems totally unmistakable. That flowering head with those dangling down wide, flattened spikelets. Nothing else like it. Never mistake that. And it mainly grows in places where the soils are on the basic side, so calcareous grasslands and some of the neutral grasslands too. But we find it among rocks as well. So the next page has got another grass. Well, actually, we've got a couple of pages of grasses, but this is a grass that that we should also not miss out on the next page here coming up. It's the wavy hairgrass, which is really common. It's one of the commonest grasses where the soils are acid. Actually, wavy hairgrass has got a new name, Avenella flexuosa. So at some point, these might get updated, but anyway, if you call it wavy hairgrass, people always know what you mean. They haven't changed the English name. Wavy because, I don't know why they gave it that name, maybe because the flowering stems and the flowering head, the branches, they're so thin, they kind of wave about, especially when there's a bit of a wind, but also they got a wavy sort of left and right wiggly shape to them, those branches within the flowering head. So it's a very delicate looking flower head that when it's right out, the branches stick out widely and the individual spikelets sort of got a sort of silvery sheen to them and little projecting hair-like horns at their tips. You don't get that many branches in a flowering head, and it's really quite openly branched. So there's a lot of space in there. And that helps to identify it, especially combined with the leaves, as we see in the left-hand photograph. They're thin and wiry, very much like the leaves of the fescues, especially the red fescue. In the size of the leaves, they're very similar to that, really. But you can tell it from the fescue. If you just got the leaves, you can look for that little ligule, that little sticking up flap at the base of the leaf blade. And it's a bit more obvious in the wavy hairgrass. It goes up to about 3 millimeters long, whereas in the fescues, it's nothing like that length. You have to really hunt around to find it, probably with a hand lens. So that's it's a really, really common grass on all kinds of acid soils, in heaths, in grasslands, in woods. So it's not surprising to find it among rocks. It's kind of among rocks in that photograph there. That was rocks in woodland, really. Okay, the next picture has got one more grass, which is again mainly on acid soils, in acid grasslands and heaths, out in the open mainly, and again, not surprising, it can grow among some rocks. Nardis, mat grass, unmistakable. It's a very densely tufted plant, dense tufts of very thin, wiry leaves, but they've got a rougher texture to them than the leaves of the sheep's fescue, the red fescue, and the wavy hairgrass. And at the base of the leaf blade, where you've got the sheath that comes wrapped up the stem, around the stem, and then you've got the blade that sticks out. Well, in the mat grass, especially low down, when you look at the lowest leaves on the stems, they stick out very abruptly at a wide angle. That's quite an unmistakable feature of it. So even if you haven't got the flowers, you can tell it by the densely tufted growth form with the leaf blades sticking out at an abrupt angle. The flowers, the flowering heads, when they first come out, they're not actually that distinctive in that they're very, very thin. They're not branched, and you've got a row of very dark coloured spikelets, all held very, very close to the stem. It's just a sort of blackish line. But when they go over, they go pale, and then they stick out, and that has been likened to a sort of fishbone effect, because the pale colour is like bone. And yeah, they look kind of fishbony. It's very common on acid soils. It's not palatable to animals, and it increases in abundance where there's a lot of grazing. Though that's more relevant, I suppose, to grassland habitats than to rock habitats. That matter of being unpalatable. Anyway, easy thing to recognise. and very, very common. On the next page, we've got some dwarf shrubs that can be very common, especially where soils are acid. Heather and bell heather. Heather's leaves are very, very tiny, and its flowers are very tiny and pale pink, compared with bell heather. It has longer leaves in whorls of 3 and bigger, darker pink flowers. And they grow mainly in heaths, but you can get sort of attenuated, little, very much more patchy versions of heath among the rocks, so they can be in the rock habitat too. The blaeberry, bilberry, we call it blaeberry up here, but and the cowberry have got broader leaves. Bilberry's leaves fall off in the autumn, and they've got toothed edges, whereas cowberry's leaves are darker and leathery and evergreen. And the bilberry, you can always tell it any time of year because the stems are green and ridged. You've got those longitudinal ridges running down them, and it's got edible berries, of course. Crowberry is a bit more like bell heather. It's got leaves that are narrow. They're actually a thicker texture than bell heather leaves, and they've got a white stripe running along the underside. Flowers are small and pale, not as conspicuous as bell heather or ordinary heather's flowers, but it has very dark blackish berries, which you can eat actually. You can eat the berries of the cowberry and the bilberry. Bilberries are the best, probably. Cowberry leaves, cowberry berries, maybe a little bit bitter. Those red ones. Crowberry berries, they're okay. I quite like them really. They're kind of crunchy. So they can be in amongst the rock habitats, especially in upland areas. And the next page has got 2 more dwarf shrubs that are not anything like these ericoid species. They look kind of more herby because they've got brighter coloured, especially one of them's got a bright big yellow flower. So if we whiz on to the next page here, we'll see, there we are. The one at the right is rock rose, with these big yellow flowers, like buttercup flowers really, but they're a bit more, if anything, bigger than most buttercup flowers. Distinctive thing, because you've got narrow leaves in opposite pairs on both the species, the wild thyme here and the rock rose. They've got relatively small narrow leaves in opposite pairs up the stem. Stems are quite thin, but they are actually woody. That's why they're dwarf shrubs. You can tell if you haven't got the flowers. Obviously, if you have got the flowers, you can tell them very easily. But if you haven't got the flowers, you can tell these 2 species apart from each other because the wild thyme's leaves are smaller. The rock rose leaves are quite a bit bigger, and they have a distinct groove running up the middle. The central vein is set in a bit of a groove. The rock rose leaves are more paler on their undersides. Big difference between upper and undersides, and more so than with the thyme. And also rock rose leaves, each leaf has 2 tiny little stipules, leaf-like stipules at its base. In the thyme, you don't get stipules. Thyme is a very common plant on base-rich or calcareous sort of soils, in calcareous grasslands especially, and it can grow amongst rock very much. It likes a soil no more than a very thin soil. It can't really compete with bigger growth of plants on deeper soils. Rock rose, similar habitat preference, but it can get into some deeper soils as well. So it's a little bit more wide-ranging, although on the whole it's not so common. But it commonly grows with the thyme. I just noticed there should be a capital A instead of I must have just not hit the capitals button in the rock rose text halfway down in the middle of that paragraph where it says also 2 tiny leaf-like stipules. Damn it. Obviously, typo. I do know that sentences begin with capital letters. Okay, the next page has got a couple of other plants, one of them common, another one rare. We can basically, don't worry about the rare one, that's the sticky catchfly. It just happens to be in that photograph. It's a very rare plant that looks a bit like red campion, but the flowers all more clustered at the tip and the leaves thinner. A rare plant of more base-rich rocky habitats. But the one really, the reason I put the photo here is because of the wood sage. That's more common in all kinds of places with thin, dry soils, especially rather acid soils. and it can get in among rocks too. And it's got that rather wrinkly upper surface of the leaf. Leaves in opposite pairs, and they've got a very sort of sage-like scent. And these clusters of spikes of very small, creamy coloured flowers. Distinctive plant. Okay, and this when near the end of all the species, and at some point we'll take a break, but I can, well, actually first, next page, we've got a couple of quick questions, which one of them is about horseshoe vetch with those yellow flowers. How do you tell it from the bird's foot trefoil, which is also a very common thing, which I did mention. And the other one, how to tell those two strawberries if you haven't got any fruits. And give you a wee while to do that.
Again, just to repeat, it's all anonymous, so you don't need to worry about what anyone thinks. No. And the plan to have a little break after we go through the answers of this, Ben?
Yeah, we can do. Yeah, then I'll be looking at, after that, I've got some photos of more of the habitat level of rocky places, and then going into the montane one.
Okay. Okay, I've ended it and shared the results now, so you can see.
Here we are. So as also I've written on the next page, the answers there. Yeah, the horseshoe vetch, the leaflets are they're pinnately divided, so lots of leaflets left and right pairs along the stem, compared with the trefoil leaf of the bird's foot trefoil. And with those strawberries, the hairs on the underside of the leaflet sticking out in the barren strawberry and depressed in the other one. Yeah, we could take a wee break now then, and then I can start looking at some habitats after that.
We're just going to take a little comfort break, so go freshen up your drink or whatever you need to do, and we'll resume in 5 minutes, so that will take us to about 2 minutes past 11 or so. We'll see you back in a minute. Thanks.
Okay.
Right, are you ready to resume then, Ben?
Yep, I'm here, yep. Mhm. Okay, so yeah, let's carry on. We'll whiz rather quickly, I think, through this next set of pictures that are photos of rock habitats at the habitat level, sort of having looked at some individual species. Stepping back, looking more widely. So here are some photos of the three of them Carboniferous limestone habitats. They're often very interesting, these limestone places. And one on the bottom right of more acid rock habitats. So the limestone ones, you've got both cliffs and screes, mainly among grasslands. Very common to find those among calcareous grasslands, and a bit of heath at the top of one of those pictures. And the acid outcrops very commonly among mixtures of heath and grassland, and in this case bracken as well, that picture on the bottom right. These are just examples of how these habitats fit into the landscape. The next photo has an example of limestone pavements, one of the particularly distinctive kinds of limestone rock habitat. Limestone pavements are very extensive in parts of the middle of Britain, around Yorkshire and South Cumbria, and also in the midwest of Ireland, or around the Burren, mid to southwest of Ireland. But we get some of them up here in Scotland as well. And this is a Scottish example on the old Durness limestone, Cambrian limestone. Similar kind of thing with the clints and grikes and the rather woodlandish flora that you can get in the shaded, down deep in those shaded cracks. Fascinating kinds of habitats. The next picture has an example of some of the limestone at a distance in that middle of Britain in northern England, as seen from the motorway, because I've hardly been on the limestone ground of those sort of places compared with the limestone places in Scotland, and some of those ones down in North Wales, where I had a photograph of it down a few pages back. Anyway, that's that kind of typical limestone pavements among calcareous grasslands that you can see in that distance, as seen from the M6 somewhere near Kendal. That's the landscape setting of it. And the next picture is very different, more kind of basaltic igneous rock cliffs and screes there among grasslands and gorse scrub in Edinburgh. And the picture after that has some unusual looking rock formations, rock habitats among grasslands. These grasslands range from acid to calcareous grasslands and woodland and bits of heath in a place not very far from here in East Lothian in Scotland. A sort of conglomerate rock outcrops with an interesting flora in them. The next page has another example of some rock habitats, rock cliff outcrop habitats in a lowland setting. Actually, that's the view from this house, or pretty much from this window, or a different window of the house. You can't see it like that now. I'm looking out there and it's pouring with kind of rain and misty. But yeah, that's a place with an interesting, quite high botanical interest, including that moss I've got a photograph of at the bottom. Mosses don't come into the NPMS, strictly speaking, although I've mentioned them in some of these documents here and there for helping to separate one kind of habitat from another. So next page has got boulder field, whereas big boulders have tumbled down, and another kind of expression of the rock habitats. These places can be fascinating, down, tucked away in the same way as you get a woodland flora kind of tucked in amongst amongst the cracks in the limestone pavements. You can get shade-loving species of vascular plants and mosses and liverworts too, in amongst the boulders in boulder fields. Fascinating habitats. They can be quite dangerous to walk in, some of the bigger ones, big drops in them, but they're mainly in the uplands. And on the next page is another example of boulder field, which is actually so much within the woodland that for NPMS purposes, we would count that in as part of the woodland rather than a separate, separate habitat, separate rock habitat. It's very much birch, or just rocky birch woodland, but those are big boulders and there are huge drops in amongst them, and it's a very fantastic place for its mosses and liverworts. It so happens that one in west of Ross. The next picture is quarry. This is near Edinburgh. Habitat that does it's fine looking rock habitat, quite varied, cliff and sort of some equivalent of boulder field, block scree-ish kind of habitat, but it's all derived from quarrying, and this quarry has then been abandoned. Quite an interesting place botanically, actually, that. So that counts in as part of the habitat that we're looking at. The next page shows what doesn't, if it's built up stuff, walls, buildings, and so on, roads. And even though they're great structures, I'd love drawing pictures of urban habitats. And if we didn't have those roads, as I say, it would be hard to get to the more natural rocky outcrops like that, rock habitats like the picture below. And the next page is just wondering if, because that was actually in America, both of those pictures on the previous page. And if which wouldn't count anyway because it's a national plant monitoring scheme, not international. But if we went international, where would the offices be? There's various places around the world. And on the next page, maybe the headquarters would be there in that dingy looking building in Flintshire in northeast Wales. How about that for headquarters of International Plant Monitoring Scheme? But actually there is some kind of nothing, I'm not trying to do down Flintshire, but because even in Flintshire there's very interesting places, including some metalliferous habitat there who are associated with old mine workings, and it's a sort of metalliferous rocks and soils being exposed, and they have their very specialized flora. You can also get them occurring in more natural ways, like the picture on the right in Ayrshire. And they can, both of those, left and right, can have a rather similar kind of flora, which includes species on the next page. One of the particular characteristic species of these metalliferous habitats is the spring sandwort, Miniatia verna. Funny looking thing, the flowers look a bit oversized compared to the shape or the size of the leaves, which are very small and narrow. It forms little tufts in places on these metalliferous soils. You get a lot of it in the Pennines, in the carboniferous limestone parts of the Pennines. There's old metal working, old lead workings there, and there's these kinds of soils in those places, sort of bare gravelly bits. And the spring sandwort, it's actually listed as an NPMS positive indicator for the montane rocky places, although it's not really much of a montane species. And somebody's written a comment. I can't get the whole of that. I think it carried on. It must have been a longer comment than the little box. Let me read. Anyway, it's a distinctive plant of metalliferous habitats. And on the next page, there's another example of that kind of rock, old sort of mine waste kind of habitat, which can have a distinctive flora, distinctive bryophyte flora as well. Actually, mosses and liverworts could be pretty good. And just seeing what it can do to the plants dwarfing those plants. That's actually bilberry growing there. See how small it is compared with that pencil. So the next page, thinking that there's potentially a negative aspect to that bilberry being growing so unbelievably small. These are the negative indicators in the non-montane rock habitat. Negative ones being things that may suggest that something ain't quite right, that's some kind of, whether it be management or something going on that's maybe interfering with the more natural ways of things. Stinging nettle is stinging nettle and creeping thistle. Those two are also among the negative indicators for various other NPMS habitats. Nettle, because it's so often an indicator of nutrient enrichment to such a degree, and artificially high nutrient enrichments that can encourage other plants a few other plants to grow big and vigorous and swamp out other smaller plants, and thereby to lead to a decreased overall botanical richness. Likewise, the creeping thistle, for rather similar reasons, but it can also increase where there's been a lot of trampling, sort of more direct disturbance, physical disturbance to the ground. Bramble, if there's not very much grazing, bramble can just spread a lot because it's actually very palatable despite being prickly. That's actually the leaves and the stems, not the berries. When I say palatable, the animals will like to just chomp away at these leaves and stems. So it can spread and outcompete other smaller plants in some places. The butterfly bush is a plant that does very well where there's been artificial disturbance, and especially followed by some period of neglect. Then it can start to colonize. Although I think I don't really see it as a hugely problematic and damaging species, in that, like some shrubs like rhododendron, of course, can get into places, non-native rhododendron, and spread and spread and spread. And the butterfly bush doesn't really do that. It's more restricted to places where that disturbance, opening up of habitat, low degree of competition with other plants, that gives it a bit of an edge. Just in those sorts of places, it doesn't really spread out very much from those. Red valerian, that can colonize out from gardens and places into some of these rocky places and do quite well. You see huge amounts of it on some walls, for example, and then it can spread out into rocky, steep grasslands, and that can be a bit of a problem, even though it's quite a nice looking plant. Okay, now on the next page we can move on to the montane Finescale habitat, with lots of rock in the montane zone, cliffs, screes, boulder fields. And the next page has a someone says, "Buddy, there's a nightmare in South Wales, spreading everywhere from woodlands." And I've been able to now expand that thing to riverbanks and chimneys. Maybe it doesn't spread so effectively in the north here, so that's interesting. So it's right for it to be on that list of negative indicators. And these ones here are some of the montane species, and if we find these in rocky places, it really is telling us we're more into the montane zone, where the climate is harsher. Stiff sedge is easy to identify when it's in flower because of the very relatively thick, stiff stem and that cluster of dark-coloured spikes, all clustered fairly close to the tip. And the leaves are rather greyish green, reasonably broad and spreading. It's very, very common in many places, right up in the montane zone, in quite a range of habitats, including rocky ones. Least willow, that can do quite well in amongst rock crevices, rock cracks, among cracks in sort of slabby, exposed rock outcrops in the montane zone, and is very small. The leaves are about the size of bilberry leaves, but they've got a more of a kind of wrinkled texture on their upper surface, more of an obvious net-veined appearance, and they can often be a bit blunter. And the stems don't have those green longitudinal, the green colour or the longitudinal ridges either. Quite different. It's a very, very small, low-grown plant. Alpine lady's mantle, easy to tell because the leaves are very starry, cut into those leaflets, whereas most other lady's mantles are more just lobe, not cut right down to separate leaflets. And they're very pale and silvery underneath, and that underneath colour goes around the edges as well. So it's like the leaves being edged with a very fine whitish silvery pen. Montane habitats, very common among rocks and in montane grasslands and heaths. Some more on the next page, some more montane species that we can get in the rocky habitats. Purple saxifrage. It's a very early flower, remarkably early, coming out when the weather's still really horrible and cold. But the leaves, for a lot of the year, we just see the leaves. and they're in these low patches and creeping, sprawling patches over the rocks. And they look a bit like thyme. They're about the same size as leaves of thyme, but they're more densely clustered along the stem. And they're in opposite pairs. And as you go up the stem from one pair to the next, each pair is swiveled around at right angles. So it looks from above as if they're in 4 ranks. And there are little hairs along the edges of the leaves. So it's actually very distinctive appearance to it compared with thyme. Mountain avens, unmistakable leaves, they're a bit like miniature oak leaves, but they're dark and quite leathery and evergreen, and they're very, very pale underneath. And it forms low mats and patches on rocks like limestone and basalt basalt kind of rocks, and has these big white flowers, quite unmistakable. And when the flowers have gone over, they go into these fluffy fruiting heads. It's not very common, but it's so distinctive where it is. It's a good montane species. Arctic bearberry, likewise, it's a low-grown, creeping kind of sub-shrub with wrinkly textured leaves with teeth on their edges, and those leaves go bright red in the autumn. So it can be a very visually distinctive feature of some montane rock habitats, mainly in very wind exposed places. And on the right, the limestone bedstraw, it looks like heath bedstraw, but if you looked at the leaves through a hand lens, you'd see that on some of them you find short little hairs that point backwards, whereas in the heath bedstraw they point forwards. You can, I mean, it's not as if you'd be going around looking at all of the little white flower bedstraw with the hand lens, because that would take up a lot of time. There's something about the limestone bedstraw, more of a sort of bit of a slightly more distant view, that is different to the heath bedstraw. The leaves are narrower, more parallel sided, a little bit darker, and they have more of a proper sharper point to their tip. And you can get your eye on for that, and obviously checking it here and there to make sure that your sort of recognition of the what they might call jizz matches the reality of which way those little hairs are pointing. But it's not that common, and it's on the base-rich rocks and soils. Among limestone and other base-rich rocks, it's quite plentiful in some places. So the next page has got some more of these herbs. We've got a whole series of these montane or herbs that are characteristic of montane habitats, even though some of them are not montane entirely, the individual species. Northern bedstraw is mainly montane, but it can get lower down in some places. Easy bedstraw to identify because the leaves are relatively large and they're in whorls of 4. The only thing you might mistake that for with leaves in 4s is crosswort, which is related to bedstraws, and it's more lowland. Crosswort has a thicker stem, has broader leaves, and the stems and leaves are really hairy. And it has yellow flowers in the axils of the leaves as well. But even when it's not in flower, the thicker, really hairy stem and the wider, really hairy leaves will separate it from northern bedstraw. And there's not very much habitat overlap because crosswort's really more lowland plant. Globe flower is like a buttercup with a big round globular flower, and its leaves are like meadow buttercup. They're palmately divided into toothed, quite deeply toothed lobes, but they're not hairy. It's sort of absolutely hairless, and it's much less common. Yellow saxifrage has these clusters of beautiful yellow flowers with quite narrow petals, but lots of flowers in a cluster, and it's very distinctive. But the leaves are really also distinctive. They're kind of, you can't see them hugely well in that photo. They're quite small, parallel, quite narrow, parallel sided, and they've got a bit of a fleshy texture, and they stick out in all directions from the stem, and the stem's rather reddish tinged. So actually even patches of that without any flowers, you can get to recognize them pretty quickly. The alpine bistort has these funny narrow flower heads with little white flowers, mainly at the top half, and they become bulbils instead of actual seeds, so they can drop off and hopefully grow into new plants. And it's mainly in flushed, slightly base-enriched places, quite a range of habitats in mountain areas, and you can get into boggy places. The next one, and quite a few of these plants, by the way, are NPMS positive indicators in this habitat. I've indicated that in the text. The next picture has some more of them. The first one of these being moss campion, which forms very dense, rather moss-like cushions of dense masses of very small, narrow leaves, a bit like a sort of giant patch of moss. But you'd know it's not moss because the leaves are much thicker textured and everything. It's a much tougher looking plant. And when it's in flower, those pink flowers are unmistakable. They're like miniature pink campion flowers. Mountain sorrel's leaves are unmistakable as well. They're very, very broad, kind of broad heart-shaped, more or less. And they've got an acidy taste. You can eat them just as you can eat ordinary sorrel leaves and wood sorrel leaves. And the flower heads are like dock flowers, similar to the flowering heads of the common sorrel. But the leaves are just totally unmistakable, that unusual broad leaf shape. It does very well in rocky places, that one in the mountains and along stream sides where the seeds must get brought down by water. The alpine stalwart, another one in similar kind of habitats, rather firm textured leaf. It's so often you see it just like that with just the leaves, because the flowering stems are pretty palatable. If you see it in flower, you'd be very lucky, and you might well be looking at it on cliffs, on grazed cliffs. The leaves are sort of edged with a purpley tinge, and they've got little distant, tiny little teeth, and they're paler underneath with quite a sort of woolly texture. The next page is some more. These are easy ones to tell on this next page. A club moss and a fern. For a club moss, all those branches come out from the base in a tuft, and it's got a very tough texture. They almost look like some artificial thing, like some kind of toy plant. Absolutely unmistakable. It grows in all sorts of places in the hills. The more montane you get, the commoner it becomes, and it can grow amongst rocks up in the hills. So that's why it's included. I've put it in here. Parsley fern is particularly characteristic of screes, and also among boulder fields here and there, and some other rocky sorts of places, but especially screes, where you get these big patches with clumps of this fern, and it's got this parsley-like look to it because the fronds are so deeply divided into very, very thin, very narrow kind of segments. The picture of it here, it's actually in a scree that's not so montane, because you can see we've got some quite tall heather in the background and then some fields further on. It's not really in the montane zone there. But the species does straddle. Some of that parsley fern, you can find it in properly in the montane zone, but also it comes down lower. It even comes down into the edges of some woodland in some parts of the country. I've seen it in just about in woodland in the Lake District, for example. It's listed as a positive indicator for the montane NPMS Finescale habitat though. And the next page, a couple of other species. There's a fern. These are uncommon, these species, but they're worth knowing if you do find them. The holly fern. It's a bit like the hard fern, with sort of simple-looking fronds just divided into single pinnae, but it's got a very tough texture, very leathery, and those little pinnae have bristly sort of teeth to them. It looks quite sort of spiny, hence the name holly fern. It likes cracks and recesses in base-rich rock-like limestone. So some of the limestone pavements and steep base-rich schists, steep outcrops of that with little cracks and things in there, you can find holly fern growing in them. Mainly in the montane zone. And the northern rock cress, another good one to find. It's got little leaves that are not hugely distinctive. They've got pinnate lobing left and right on these quite small leaves, but the flowers are relatively large for quite a small plant. White flowers with 4 petals there. It's a crucifer. Grows on base-rich rock. And the next one has some, you never mistake this plant for anything. Rose root, great big thing, very conspicuous, one of the more conspicuous herbs of upland rocky places, especially on rock ledges and in crevices where the soil's fairly basic. It's got a very thick, fleshy texture, grayish green color, absolutely unmistakable, and those heads of yellow flowers that can get a bit reddish as well. And it forms big clumps. You can pick them out from a distance, and it helps when you're up in these upland rocky places, cliffs usually, that that's a species that can pick out the bits of areas of rock outcrop and cliff that are not so acid. The acid ones tend to have a bit of a different flora in similar places, including more of the blaeberry and wood rush. Whereas this species, yeah, it's like from a distance, sometimes you can pick out base-rich woodland by areas of ash instead of oak and birch. Well, this is the counterpart of that when you're looking at cliffs from a little bit of a distance, through binoculars maybe, and pick out the base-rich bits with the roseroot. Next page has got the stone bramble, which looks from its leaves a bit like wild strawberry, but you can always tell it from that because the middle leaflet is on a stalk of its own, whereas in the wild strawberry and the barren strawberry, of course, the three leaflets all come from exactly the same place. But in other ways, it does look a bit like the wild strawberry, the shape and the shape of the leaflets, toothing along the edges, and the fact that it has those runners as well. It kind of creeps around mainly over rocky ground. It's much less common than the wild strawberry, and is mainly in upland places on rocky ground like cliffs and rocky in rocky woods. You find it as well. So it has a white flower that looks a bit like a bramble flower. It's in the same genus as bramble. The page after this has got some montane willows. These are comparatively rare, really, and we won't go into identification details for them. Suffice to say that the more montane end of the rock, the montane fine-scale rock habitat can include populations of some of these relatively rare montane willows. And the next page, we got some questions. What species is this one on the top and the one underneath? And to help, yes, you've been given some multiple choice. So I'll give you a wee while.
We do love a good picture quiz as well. That's always good.
Mm.
I try and choose potentially confusing species, but it's quite some of the rock ones because they're so distinctive. It's worth noting, just while we're waiting for people to vote, that I'm going to try and get this recording put on the YouTube channel this afternoon as I'm away for the beginning of next week. But if I don't, I promise it'll be on sort of Thursday next week. So people can re-watch to their heart's content. Right, I think most people have finished.
Yeah. Everybody got the parsley fern. It really does look like parsley, doesn't it? I don't know if it tastes the same. Probably doesn't. I've never tried eating it. Yep, the yellow saxifrage. I don't know if you remember, I mentioned that stem is often rather reddish, and the leaves have a fleshy texture, narrow, parallel sides for the most of their length, and they stick out in all directions. So these clumps, it looks a bit stonecropish. These other species you've got there, stonecrop, because the leaves are rather fleshy. They've got little hairs along their edge, so it's in a way it kind of looks vaguely a bit like the hairy stonecrop, which is much less common. But it's a bigger plant, this one, and it forms patches, much more sort of dense clump forming. Obviously, when it's in flower, that's much more. You can tell it from those stonecrops. Lady's bedstraw doesn't have the fleshy texture, doesn't really have those reddish stems. and the leaves are narrower still, and they're in whorls, as is the case with all bed straws, ladies' bed straws, so, in whorls of up to about a dozen, actually, even leaves, and it grows in different places, not such wet places. The saxifrage is mainly in places where it's at least damp, flushed, maybe running water flowing over the surface some of the time, and base rich. Okay, so there's on the next page those where are we now? There's the answers to those questions written down there again, and we've got some more pictures here where you've got been given a multiple choice. So I'll give you a minute to have a think about that.
Yeah, there's two pictures, so two different species, so multiple options. It's quite a tricky one, this one, because the leaves are fairly, you know, sort of similar to a lot of other things. So yeah, you might want to give us the answers then, Ben.
Okay. In fact, that's well, I've written them on the next page. But before we go on to the next page, I'm just going to click off that polls thing so we can see the photos better. Yeah, the one on the left is the stone bramble, and the one on the right is the wild strawberry. You can see how they both got some things in common: the shapes of the leaflets, those jaggy toothed edges, and the presence of runners. You know, creeping stems in both species, but the Rubus saxatilis, the stone bramble on the left, has its middle leaflet on its own separate stalk. That's the crucial way of telling it from the wild strawberry, where all those three leaflets come from exactly the same place. So none of the leaflets are stalked. So, and that was just mentioned on that other page with the answers. So now on to the next page, we've got a few more pages of habitats, like we did with the non-montane one, species first, and then looking at it at the sort of broader habitat level, looking at the different kind of assemblages, different settings of this habitat. So here's one example, which is where we get steep, cliffy places with tall herb ledge vegetation. And it's fascinating stuff. In this example here, we've got a lot of that rose root, which indicates that it's not too acidic. And there's a lot of globe flower, those yellow flowers of that. This is a very herb-rich, species-rich, and bryophyte-rich, lots of mosses and liverworts there too, example of montane cliff ledge vegetation on the Isle of Skye. So a great habitat. The next page shows how it can be also not so thickly vegetated, but still of botanical interest. This one here in Perthshire, it's got a lot of small plants scattered around with a montane element. There's the alpine lady's mantle. You can see the starry leaves of that just sort of above, right from centre. There's bits of yellow saxifrage and green spleenworts and various other things. It's on some limestone, pretty rich flora, even though from a distance people might think it doesn't look much, but it's actually really very interesting. And the next page has something kind of similarly base rich. This is on basalt in the West Highlands, and it's a big clump, a big patch of dryas, the mountain avens, which has passed its flowering, but the flowers have gone into these fluffy sort of fruiting heads, very, very distinctive. Otherwise, it's growing with other species that in themselves aren't montane, like the thyme, for example. And there's some bit of devil's bit scabious in there. You see the leaves of it. But it's a montane, definitely the habitat would class as montane, even though it's not actually that high up there. That's what happens when you go in the far north and west. The next page has got some examples of it in upland places that's showing how the rock habitat can be, the montane rock habitat can be mixed up with heaths, whether it be scree or rock outcrop or boulders. Here we're seeing examples of them in the West Highlands on the left, mixed up with heath, and on the right, likewise, a lot of scree there going right up to the high ground of Benaglow in Perthshire. So they sort of the heath vegetation can gradually fizzle out into the rock habitat, in the same way that grassland vegetation, like on the Carboniferous limestone, calcareous grassland, can sort of fizzle out gradually into rocks and screes. So the next picture has got more high altitude again. Actually, this is up in the Ben Nevis range, where there's cliffs and screes associated with snowbed vegetation, and the latest, like the what we call late snowbed habitats, that's where the snow lies longest. They've got their own plant communities, which are mainly very small plants, a lot of mosses and liverworts, and little dotted with things like stiff sedge and little dwarf willow. But they're scattered in such a way that from a distance you might think it was kind of almost bearish ground, but they're actually fascinating places botanically. And then they merge in with actual more genuinely more actually bare scree, as we can see here, scree and rocky cliff places. So it's another setting for those rock habitats. Next page has got another one. Amongst montane grasslands and montane heaths, and when you get right up into the montane zone, the heaths are not so different looking from the grasslands because you don't get so much heather in them as more bilberry or blaeberry and cowberry and crowberry, so they're kind of greener looking heaths from a distance. So it all looks kind of just green grassy stuff, but it's not all grassland, mixed in with rock outcrops. That's in the Ben Nevis range as well, pretty high up. And the next page has got a particularly distinctive rock habitat that we get in the uplands, in the montane zone of the uplands. This is what we call fell field. It's mainly, you find it particularly well developed on basalt, the tertiary basalt of the West Highlands. And it's these patches, they can be quite sharply delineated, some of them, of just looks like kind of gravel, very, small stones, and they've got actually quite a rich flora among them, very sparse flora, bits and pieces of things like thyme, some little grasses. There's some quite rare plants do grow in them. The Conigia, the Iceland purslane, that's very much the habitat of that species, not in this site photographed here, which is on the mainland of the West Highlands, but there are a couple of sites, one in Skye and one in Mull, that have that very same habitat with little tiny plants of Iceland purslane growing in it. And you get something similar in the Faroe Islands, and I think in Iceland as well. I've seen it in the Faroes, lots and lots of it. So it's a very, very particular kind of rock habitat and has its own flora as well. The next page has got some of the species that we find in the basalt fell fields of the West Highlands. The middle one, particularly distinctive, the little hairy stonecrop with little rather fleshy leaves, which are a bit hairy. That's a really particularly small plant there. Pinkish flowers, they're mainly pink, they can be a bit whitish. It's not very common, that species. It's actually more common in southern Scotland and northern England, in flushy places in the hills, quite different habitats, actually more thickly vegetated, and you get patches of it among grasses and sedges and rushes. The spiked woodrush on the left likes rocky, stony, open places in the mountains, including these fell fields. And it's a bit like the much more common heath woodrush, Lusula multiflora, but the flower spike is more elongated and seems to be a bit too heavy for the stalk because it always pulls it over, and it sort of arches down, it hangs down. Very distinctive. And that little moss, Racemitrium ellipticum, is very, very much a feature of the western basalt fellfield habitats, really distinctive. And on the Faroes, it becomes really, really common as well. It's a western oceanic moss species. That photograph's actually taken not in fellfield, it's on a steep rock face in different kind of place, which is why on the next page I swiveled it around. I could have put it in like that in the first place and not said, but I'm not trying to hide that from you. So I'm being honest, it's taking a different habitat. Anyway, next page has some examples of that habitat that would be counted as the montane NPMS fine-scale habitat, because we get this very much more of a montane flora, some of the montane species occurring in it, which reflects the harsh climate that you get, even lower down below 600 meters, when we get right up into the northwesternmost parts of Britain. So the one on the left on the mountain of Quinag in Sutherland, and the one on the right in Morven in the West Highlands, quite different. The one on the left is more acid, the one on the right is more base rich basalt. But both of them, they're not that high up, but by the time you got to those kind of altitudes in that part of the world, you can be in a pretty severe environments, climatically speaking, and that is reflected in the vegetation. So it's kind of montane, climatically speaking, a montane environment. There's another one on the next page where it's a drawing, not a photograph. Ben Earden, this is in the Midwest Highlands, big basalt mountain with great montane flora on that dark, threatening looking north-facing slope. There's lots of interesting plants on there. The rock is dark, and it's a bit dark because it's shaded. It's a great hill. And again, it's not very high. The top of that hill is about 570 something meters. So it doesn't get 600, but it's a montane environment. Then on the next page is some of the tall herb vegetation on that very slope, with a lot of rose root, greater wood rush in it. It's quite a lush flora actually when you're in there. You can when you just look down close, in some respects, because of the lushness of it, you might not think you are in such a montane environment. One of those species being the melancholy thistle on the left, great big masses of that. So we're almost at the end, and because we're not far off midday, the 2 hours session. So the next page has negative indicators in the montane fine-scale habitat. And the first three overlap with what we had in the non-montane one, and they're there for the same reasons. And the ones on the right, ragwort is a negative indicator in a number of other NPMS habitats. It's, well, partly because it's toxic, isn't it? And it can increase where there's been a lot of trampling by animals as well. And the docks, the big dockens, broad-leaved and curled dock, can be in the same kind of places as thistles. They can increase for similar reasons, where there's been some kind of ground disturbance and nutrient enrichment as well. There's we got those 5 species on this page, but none of them are actually really that common in the truly in the montane zone. By the time we get into montane environments, those species are comparatively scarce. So if you did find them there, yeah, then it could suggest that there's been some kind of effect, for example, here and there you might find bits of stinging nettle. If you're in a place that's fairly sheltered, relatively sheltered, and sheep and deer have been congregating for quite a bit of time, and so there's the effect of dung and urine. That's one of the more likely ones. Bramble would hardly make it into the truly montane zone, really. It'd be quite interesting to find bramble in a properly montane environment. But yeah, if you found any of them there, then it's definitely worth noting if you find them in the montane zone. And that's almost at the end of this presentation. One more page, it's the last page, where actually in that text of this last year, this was the very last of all of the ones that I did, which is why I said something to that effect. In this year, it's not quite the last, is it? Because there's another one next week, which is bogs and wet heath. But yeah, I hope this quick tour has been of interest and of use.
Yeah.
And thank you very much all for coming, and any questions do ask.
Please do start sending your questions in, and I'll keep monitoring. Otherwise, it could be the case where, Ben, you've already told everyone everything and they feel like they know everything, so that's brilliant. I have to say, the huge list of plants there that I've never seen and are on my to-see list at some point. I'm very much a bit of a southern softie, so I haven't really explored botanically much more than north of the Midlands, really. But that's still to come at some point in my life, I'm sure. So I thought also it might be worth just quickly running over in terms of if you are going to be surveying any rock outcrops, cliff faces or screes as part of your NPMS square, then if they are sort of an actual scree or a rock face, then you might not necessarily want to do them obviously as a square or a traditional linear. So just to go through what the guidance note says, it says for recording rock outcrops, the long dimension of the linear plot should be placed along the base of the rock outcrop. So basically at the sort of safest point, because we don't want anyone climbing halfway up. And then the shorter dimension should be extend vertically up the face of the outcrop to around head height. Again, making this easier and safer to identify everything within that period. So you're not having to try and scramble up to see what something is. So therefore it equates to about a 2 metre high plot by about 12.5 metres long. And that means that you shouldn't take any unnecessary risks. When looking at screes in particular, you should use the same dimensions, so the 12.5 by 2 metres, but it should be recorded as just a single traverse. So we don't want you sort of trying to record everything within that period by having to kind of go back and forth over where you've already stepped. You'd almost treat it like a transect. So starting from the first point, walking across, noting the species that are present within 1 metre either side of yourself on the route taken. And again, we don't expect it to be a single sort of straight line. It should follow the natural sort of curve or sort of rock face that is safe. So don't take any unnecessary risks by trying to do it in a straight line, which means that you've got to sort of, mountain goat up another bit or something. If it slopes downwards, that's fine. Because at the end of the day, we really don't want anyone sort of putting themselves at risk for the sake of the monitoring scheme. Let me see, we've got no specific questions, just people that are joined late and they'll watch the recordings. That's absolutely fine. It can be a bit of a long slog. But yeah, if there's no more questions, which if there aren't any now, you can always email me. Also, once the video and recordings put on YouTube, you could always put your questions in the comments below, and I always see those and we'll get back to them. So if something doesn't sort of occur to you now, it might later. And yeah, Ben's right. Next week we've got our last webinar on bog and wet heath. So very much come along to that one. Great, thanks so much, Ben, and enjoy your weekend, whatever you're doing, and we'll see you at the next one. So thank you.
Okay, I can thank everybody. Thank you everybody for coming, and goodbye.
Bye everyone. Bye.
Okay, bye.